In 2015, Maple Hollow was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to escape chaos. Tucked away in the countryside, it had just enough shops to be convenient, just enough people to feel alive, and just enough silence to feel safe. Rows of tidy homes, trimmed hedges, and familiar faces gave it the charm of a postcard town. Outsiders called it boring. Residents called it home. It was the last place anyone expected a nightmare to begin. Daniel and Teresa Wilkins arrived in town during the fall. Their house on Elmwood Lane was a beautiful colonial-style property that had sat empty for nearly a year. Locals were thrilled to see it bought and restored. The couple moved in quietly, making small improvements over time, repainting the shutters, replanting the garden, repairing the fence. To the neighbors, they were a breath of fresh air. Daniel introduced himself as a high school chemistry teacher. He had a kind smile, neat hair, and a habit of waving to anyone who passed by. Teresa was more reserved. She often stayed inside, working on her art, but when she did emerge, she was soft-spoken and polite. She told the neighbors she was preparing for an upcoming gallery exhibition in the city. They blended in quickly. Within a month, they were attending block parties and local events. Daniel coached a small science club for kids at the community center. Teresa offered to paint a mural for the local library. Everyone agreed. The Wilkins were exactly the kind of people the neighborhood needed, but not everyone was fully convinced. Mrs. Ellis, an elderly widow who had lived on Elmwood Lane for over 4 decades, told her daughter on the phone that she found something off about them. She didn't like how Daniel never seemed tired after long workdays, or how Teresa never invited anyone inside their house. She pointed out how the curtains were always drawn, even on sunny days. But her concerns were brushed off as paranoia. After all, people had said the same thing about the couple who used to own the house before them. Then, in March of the following year, 15-year-old Ava Morrison disappeared. She was last seen leaving school, walking the same route she always did. A 10-minute walk that ended in silence. Her parents called the police when she didn't come home by dinner. Search parties formed overnight. Flyers were stapled to telephone poles. Volunteers combed the woods. But there were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, no blood, no answers. The town was shaken. Maple Hollow had never seen a missing child case. Police urged parents to keep their children close. Schools shortened hours. The community watched one another more closely, though no one ever imagined that the Wilkins might be involved. They had an alibi. Daniel had been at school. Teresa had posted art updates on social media. Nothing connected them to Ava's disappearance. 2 months later, another teenager vanished. 14-year-old Jasmine Wu, a neighbor who often rode her bike near the woods after school. Her bicycle was found, leaning against a tree. But she was gone, as if swallowed by the earth. This time, panic spread faster. Rumors flew, and suspicion fell on unfamiliar faces: delivery drivers, traveling workers, even new families who'd moved in recently. Police tried to find a link between the two girls, but came up empty. There were no overlaps in their schedules. No shared enemies, no digital footprints suggesting they'd known one another. Both girls had been bright, well-liked, and had no history of running away. The neighborhood was gripped by fear. Doors that once stayed open were now locked tight. Parents installed security cameras. Teenagers no longer walked home alone. Yet somehow, the Wilkins remained untouched by the unease. Daniel continued teaching. Teresa posted updates about her upcoming gallery showing. They smiled at neighbors, dropped off casseroles, and carried on as if nothing had changed. Then something strange began happening. A few people reported a foul odor near the Wilkins property, especially after rainfall. One neighbor thought it was a sewer problem. Another assumed a wild animal had died under the porch. The Wilkins explained it away each time. Daniel said it was the compost pile. Teresa blamed the mulch. And people believed them. Why wouldn't they? But retired veteran George Harris, who lived directly across the street, was more observant. He spent most evenings on his front porch, reading or watching the street. Over time, he noticed odd behavior. Daniel would sometimes go into the shed in the middle of the night. Teresa could be seen digging in the garden even during rainstorms. They rarely had visitors, yet trash bags were constantly being taken out. Bags that Daniel always loaded into his trunk rather than placing by the curb. George mentioned it to a few neighbors, but no one took him seriously. He started jotting notes, dates, times, what he saw. It was harmless at first, curiosity, but the feeling in his gut grew stronger. Something wasn't right. One evening, just after midnight, George looked out his window and saw Daniel struggling to carry a large black bag across the backyard. It appeared too heavy for just garbage. George took a photo with his old phone and decided to leave an anonymous tip for the police. Still, without hard evidence, there was little the police could do. A photo of a man carrying a bag wasn't enough for a search warrant. The Wilkins continued life as usual. The garden bloomed. The smell returned. And still, no one connected them to the missing girls. But everything changed when the rains came. A massive storm hit Maple Hollow in late June, flooding parts of the town and softening the ground. After it passed, a neighbor's dog, digging near the Wilkins fence, unearthed something. A bone. At first glance, it looked like it belonged to a deer or a large dog. But the neighbor, curious and unnerved, took it to a nearby vet to be sure. The vet didn't take long. It wasn't an animal bone. It was human. A fragment of a femur, small enough to belong to a teenage girl. The police were called instantly. What began as a small tip turned into a full-scale investigation. The Wilkins property was sealed off. Search teams with cadaver dogs arrived. Forensic experts moved in. Shovels hit the dirt. And what they uncovered would destroy the illusion. Maple Hollow had lived under for nearly a year. Multiple shallow graves, skeletal remains, clothing fibers, personal items, tooth fragments. Everything led to the same conclusion. Something truly evil had been living right in the heart of their quiet, peaceful town. The truth was no longer hiding. It was clawing its way out of the ground. The discovery of human remains behind the Wilkins house sent shockwaves through Maple Hollow. News crews arrived within hours. Reporters lined the street, filming the yellow police tape that now wrapped around the once idyllic home. The same house that had hosted summer barbecues, friendly waves, and warm smiles was now the centerpiece of a horror story unfolding in real time. Residents stood at a distance, watching in silence as investigators moved in and out of the yard. Every few hours, another evidence bag was wheeled out. It became painfully clear this wasn't just about Ava Morrison or Jasmine Wu. There were more victims, possibly many more. Cadaver dogs led searchers to several disturbed patches of soil. Forensics teams marked the graves with orange flags and slowly began excavation. The first body recovered was largely decomposed, wrapped in what appeared to be a bedsheet. Beneath that, more skeletal remains were uncovered bones, stacked in a way that suggested careless, hurried burials. The grave was shallow, only 2 feet deep. Whoever buried them hadn't been trying to preserve them. They were simply trying to hide them. Each time a new set of remains was discovered, a heavy silence fell over the crowd outside. Parents pulled their children away. Some people wept. Others stood numb. There had never been anything like this in Maple Hollow. It wasn't just grief that hung in the air, it was betrayal. The realization that someone they knew, someone they had trusted, could be responsible for such cruelty. Daniel and Teresa Wilkins were both taken into custody. They didn't resist. In fact, Daniel seemed strangely calm, as if he had been expecting. Teresa kept her eyes down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she was placed in the back of a patrol car. The community that had once welcomed them now watched in stunned silence as the illusion shattered. The investigation quickly turned inward. Police secured a warrant to search the Wilkins home, starting with the backyard and then moving inside. What they found would soon become the stuff of nightmares. Inside the basement, a discovery was made that turned the case from horrifying to monstrous. A section of the concrete floor was newer than the rest. Investigators drilled into it and found a false slab, beneath which lay a trapdoor hidden from plain view and sealed tight. When opened, it revealed a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. At the bottom of the stairs was a small room, roughly 8 feet by 10, with soundproofed walls and a single flickering bulb. Inside, there were shackles fixed into the concrete, a stained mattress, and a small shelf containing duct tape, rope, and a knife. The room smelled of mildew, sweat, and something worse. There were also personal belongings, items that linked directly to the victims. A pink scrunchie Ava's mother had mentioned in her statement. Jasmine's bracelet. A torn piece of a school uniform. But it wasn't just evidence of captivity. There were signs of psychological torment, scribbled messages on the walls in red marker, phrases like, "Be quiet, be better," and "She's watching." The writing appeared to be in multiple hands, some small and shaky, others bold and deliberate. High above the shelf, a small camera had been mounted, pointing directly at the center of the room. The memory card inside held hours of footage, though most of it was corrupted from age or damage. What could be salvaged was sent immediately for forensic analysis. In an upstairs closet, detectives found a locked metal box. Inside were neatly arranged journals, all handwritten by Teresa. Each journal covered a different period, starting nearly 3 years before the Wilkins had even arrived in Maple Hollow. They detailed not just the methods, but the philosophy behind their crimes. Teresa's writings described a warped belief that certain people needed to be cleansed through suffering. She wrote of Daniel as the shepherd and referred to herself as the chisel shaping broken lives into something purer. Daniel's laptop revealed even more. Hidden behind layers of encryption were files containing recordings, victim profiles, and diagrams of restraint systems. He had cataloged everything: dates, times, locations. It became clear that the couple had committed similar crimes before moving to Maple Hollow. Police traced their previous residences and discovered 2 other homes where suspicious disappearances had occurred but were never solved. At one property, nearly 150 miles away, ground-penetrating radar detected more anomalies beneath the garden shed. That search would soon yield 2 more bodies, one of which matched the description of a runaway case from 3 years prior. Back in Maple Hollow, the mood shifted from horror to hysteria. Parents kept their children home from school. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. People demanded answers, but law enforcement was still piecing together the scale of the crimes. The number of victims was growing, and each discovery brought more pain. The town's local police force had never dealt with something of this magnitude. They brought in federal agents, forensic psychologists, and anthropologists to assist. Every bone fragment, every hair sample, every speck of blood was analyzed. DNA testing confirmed the identities of 5 victims, 2 of them, Ava and Jasmine. The other 3 were girls who had never even been reported missing, likely runaways or drifters. The couple had targeted for that very reason that Teresa refused to speak during questioning. She stared at the wall, her lips pressed tight. Daniel, on the other hand, gave long, rambling statements that made little sense. He claimed he was helping the girls shed their brokenness. He never expressed remorse, only frustration that his work had been interrupted. Psychological evaluations later revealed what many feared. Both Daniel and Teresa shared delusional, narcissistic beliefs. They saw themselves as saviors, not killers. This shared psychosis, often called folie à deux, explained how 2 seemingly normal individuals could commit such atrocities together and maintain a facade of normal life. The media coverage grew more intense. The story made national headlines. People from around the country sent messages of support to the victims' families. Memorials were built outside the school where Ava and Jasmine had once studied. Candlelight vigils lined the streets. Flowers were left at the entrance to Elmwood Lane, even as the house remained locked behind police barricades. But the damage was done. Maple Hollow had lost its innocence. The neighbors who had once shared summer potlucks now locked their doors and looked at one another with suspicion. Children who had played freely in the yards now asked hard questions their parents didn't know how to answer. And at the center of it all stood the Wilkins house, a home built on a lie, hiding a chamber of cruelty beneath its floorboards. No one could believe it had taken so long to uncover. But perhaps that was the most terrifying part of all. The realization that evil didn't always come with sirens or red flags. Sometimes it came with a smile, a plate of cookies, and an open invitation to the neighborhood barbecue. As the days passed, the investigation into Daniel and Teresa Wilkins grew more complicated and deeply disturbing. The horror buried beneath their cheerful smiles ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Federal agents unearthed a chilling pattern of calculated movement and planning, a history of towns like Maple Hollow that had unknowingly welcomed monsters into their midst. Authorities tracked the couple's past by tracing property records, digital footprints, and financial transactions. What emerged was a haunting map: small towns in 3 different states where the Wilkins had lived for short periods, always in homes with secluded yards or large basements. Each residence coincided with the unexplained disappearances of vulnerable young girls. In most cases, the victims had been brushed off as runaways or lost to urban drift. One house in rural Indiana had a similar trapdoor beneath the basement. The concrete had been poured over recently, but forensic teams broke through and discovered bone fragments, again wrapped in sheets, again marked by hurried burial. The couple's movements were strategic, well-researched, and terrifyingly precise. They always chose quiet towns with underfunded police departments and close-knit communities, unlikely to suspect their own. Back in Maple Hollow, every piece of evidence uncovered inside the Wilkins house seemed to speak louder than the last. Inside the attic, investigators discovered a disturbing collection of childlike drawings, crude stick figures with X's for eyes, labeled with names of known and unknown victims. Alongside the drawings were dozens of VHS tapes and mini-discs. Some were too damaged to play, but the ones that worked showed recordings of the basement cell. Not all the victims were identified, but what was captured on those tapes confirmed the worst fears of law enforcement. One video showed a young girl, her face pale and thin, whispering something to the camera before the feed cut out. Another showed Daniel walking in and out of frame, muttering softly, adjusting restraints, and scribbling notes. In one corner of the video, a date stamp read, the 3rd of December, 14 months before anyone in Maple Hollow had even known the Wilkins existed. Despite the horror, investigators pressed on. Every scrap of clothing, every stain on the walls, every fingerprint was analyzed. Behind a loose panel in the kitchen, crime scene technicians found a bloodied notebook filled with coded entries. It took cyber experts nearly a week to decipher them, and what they revealed sent chills through the entire task force. Each entry matched a victim. The notes were brief dates, initials, and cryptic lines like 3 days, resisted too long, and silence achieved. Some entries were marked with stars or crosses, symbols that forensic psychologists later interpreted as signs of how successful the victims had been in meeting the Wilkins' twisted expectations. The language was clinical, void of empathy. It was as if they were cataloging experiments rather than human beings. As details became public, the town's grief shifted into anger. Public outcry grew louder. People demanded to know how this could have gone unnoticed for so long. How 2 people with no prior criminal record could have crossed state lines, buried bodies, and constructed torture rooms without ever raising red flags. The school where Daniel had worked launched its own internal review. Though no students reported inappropriate behavior, several faculty members admitted Daniel had always seemed too perfect. He never lost his temper, never arrived late, never declined to help. In hindsight, they said, it was eerie. His image had been spotless and ideal teacher, beloved by students and parents alike. And yet behind closed doors, he was methodically orchestrating one of the most horrifying crime sprees the state had ever seen. Teresa, meanwhile, remained a mystery. Investigators scoured her past but found almost no digital presence prior to 2010, no records of employment, no school transcripts, no photos. It was as if she had erased her identity before reinventing herself. But a break came when a retired police officer from a small Missouri town recognized her photo. Years earlier, a woman by the name of Angela Resnick had been questioned in connection with a missing teen case, though never arrested. When investigators compared fingerprints, the match was confirmed. Teresa Wilkins had once been Angela Resnick and had disappeared just after that case went cold. This revelation led to a grim realization. Teresa had been involved in the disappearances long before she ever met Daniel. She wasn't just his accomplice, she was his mentor. Her journals, when reviewed again, took on new meaning. In early entries, she wrote about training him, guiding his impulses and choosing locations. Later entries described how he had perfected the method. The pair hadn't stumbled into darkness together, They had built it side by side. The pair hadn't stumbled into side by side. Legal system now faced the enormous task of prosecuting both of them. District attorneys from multiple states coordinated charges, working together to ensure a conviction. The list was staggering. Multiple counts of kidnapping, torture, murder, desecration of human remains, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. Meanwhile, the town of Maple Hollow tried to rebuild. The house on Elmwood Lane stood empty, its windows boarded, its gate padlocked. Children crossed the street to avoid walking past it. Some wanted it demolished. Others argued it should remain, a reminder of what had happened and a warning of what could happen again. The local church held weekly support meetings. Therapists volunteered their time to counsel families of victims and neighbors traumatized by the case. Ava Morrison's parents moved out of town. Jasmine Yu's mother couldn't return to work and was later hospitalized for stress-related complications. Grief became the town's new language, spoken in silent glances and long. Yet even with justice served, the damage left behind was irreversible. The house on Elmwood Lane became the subject of national attention once again. A non-profit group lobbied to have it demolished and replaced with a memorial park. The town council agreed, and within a month, demolition crews arrived. The basement was filled with concrete before the structure was raised. On the land where so much pain had been hidden, a small garden was planted, roses and lily, surrounding a plaque that read, "In memory of those lost, in honor of those who survived." Maple Hollow struggled to heal. Children returned to school, but parents clung tighter to them than ever. Teachers underwent new training. Background checks became stricter. Neighborhoods grew more vigilant, but also more fearful. The trust that had once bound the town was now tinged with paranoia. Across the country, the Wilkins case sparked debates on how crimes of such scale could go unnoticed for so long. Documentaries were produced, podcasts aired, multi-part investigations, and law enforcement agencies examined their methods for handling missing persons. The case became a painful example of systemic failure, and a warning that monsters didn't always look like monsters. In prison, Daniel reportedly kept to himself, while Teresa refused all interviews or visits. Rumors swirled that she had stopped eating for days, only breaking silence to scribble in notebooks that prison guards weren't allowed to read. The contents of those pages remain unknown. Families of the victims formed a support group that met monthly, offering solace to one another. They hosted an annual vigil in the new garden, lighting candles and reading names aloud. Though the pain never truly faded, these gatherings created a small thread of unity. Grief transformed into remembrance. And for the rest of the country, the story of the Wilkins served as a chilling reminder. Evil doesn't always scream from behind locked doors. Sometimes it smiles from the front porch, waves to neighbors, and asks if you'd like a cup of tea. In the years following the Wilkins trial, the story refused to fade. The media frenzy had long since died down, the headlines replaced by newer tragedies. But for Maple Hollow and for those forever linked to the victims, the nightmare never truly ended. The house was gone. The grass had grown back. Children played again in the park that now stood where horror had once lived. But the scars were deep, and not all of them were visible. Detectives who had worked the case struggled with what they'd seen. Some retired early, unable to shake the images of the basement or the sounds from the recovered tapes. Others became advocates for reform, working to change how law enforcement responded to missing persons reports. What had happened in Maple Hollow and in the Wilkins' other homes was no longer just a cautionary tale. It had become a catalyst. In 2026, 2 years after the trial, Congress passed the Safe Communities Act, a law mandating improved coordination between state police departments and requiring deeper background checks for those working in positions of trust, like teachers and caregivers. The bill was unofficially dubbed Ava's Law, named after the bright-eyed girl whose disappearance had finally exposed the horrors. Buried beneath Elmwood Lane, her parents had pushed for the legislation, appearing on news programs, sitting through hearings, and reliving their trauma over and over again so no one else would have to. But while laws changed and awareness grew, the mystery surrounding the Wilkins themselves remained an unsettling void. Who were they before they became what they became? Why had they chosen such a path? Psychologists had dissected their behavior, examining everything from narcissism to delusional disorders. Still, no explanation ever truly satisfied the public's hunger for understanding. The journals offered only glimpses, cold and calculated, not inside. It was during the 3rd year after their conviction that a new development shocked everyone. A series of letters, believed to have been smuggled out of prison, were published online by a fringe website. The source was unverified, but experts who reviewed the handwriting and phrasing confirmed it was almost certainly Teresa's. The letters were addressed to no one in particular, but they spoke directly to the events that had unfolded. In one of them, she wrote, "We never started with blood. We started with silence. The world taught us that people vanish every day and no one notices. We just noticed first." The line struck a disturbing chord. To Teresa, their crimes weren't just acts of violence. They were an exploration of society's blind spots. A cruel experiment conducted over years, hidden behind charm, good manners, and a picket fence. In another letter, she described choosing neighborhoods, noting how people rarely questioned couples who volunteered at schools or donated to charity. Trust was their camouflage. The letters also hinted at more victims, people never found, names never spoken aloud. One passage listed cryptic initials and dates, none matching existing case files. Investigators reopened old files, expanded searches, but the trail was cold. The possibility that dozens more had fallen into the Wilkins' hands and never been discovered deepened a horror that had already been confirmed. In response, a task force was created to investigate the shadow list. Retired agents and forensic analysts pored over missing person reports dating back 15 years, looking for links. Satellite imagery, credit card histories, and even soil samples from former Wilkins properties were reviewed again. But nothing conclusive emerged. It was like chasing smoke. Meanwhile, Daniel Wilkins remained silent. While Teresa wrote her cryptic letters, he withdrew. Prison guards reported that he refused visitors, barely spoke, and spent most of his time staring at the floor of his cell. Some believed he was ashamed. Others suspected he feared Teresa's growing infamy was eclipsing his own twisted legacy. Whether it was guilt or jealousy, no one could say. The public's obsession with the case surged once again when a documentary streaming series featured the Wilkins under the title Beneath the Floorboards. Interviews with survivors, police, journalists, and even a childhood neighbor of Teresa, Angela Resnick, as she was once known, painted a fuller but still disturbing picture. The show didn't glorify the killers. Instead, it focused on the resilience of those who had escaped or endured their loss. Isabel Calderon, now in her mid-20s, became a central voice in the final episode. Her life had been shattered at 16, but she had rebuilt herself piece by piece. She worked as a counselor for at-risk youth, dedicating her life to ensuring no other teenager fell through the cracks. Her strength was undeniable. Viewers were captivated, not by the Wilkins' darkness, but by the survivor's light. Still, the lingering question was one that no one could answer. How many more? The Memorial Garden in Maple Hollow expanded in response to that question. New plaques were added, not with names but with the phrase unknown, but never forgotten. It became a place of mourning, not just for the identified victims, but for the silent ones, the missing whose stories may never be told. And Maple Hollow itself changed. A new police chief was appointed. The local school system introduced mental health awareness programs. The neighborhood watch evolved into a robust community network that checked in on isolated residents and partnered with social workers. What had once been a sleepy, trusting town became a model of community vigilance and trauma-informed care. For those closest to the case, moving on was impossible, but they learned how to live again. Ava's parents adopted a foster child, a quiet girl who reminded them of Ava in small, subtle ways. Jasmine Wu's older brother became an artist, creating paintings inspired by her memory that were displayed in galleries across the state. Even the former lead detective, who had once feared the Wilkins would haunt him forever, began speaking at conferences about investigative reform. But the truth about evil is that it rarely announces itself. It arrives dressed in normalcy, smiles. During backyard barbecues, waves from across the street. That was the lesson Maple Hollow carried forward, not one of fear, but one of vigilance. That monsters don't live in the dark anymore. Sometimes they live in the light. And so the story of the Wilkins couple became more than a headline. It became a warning, a cry for awareness, and most of all, a reminder that beneath any house, no matter how picture-perfect something horrific, can be hiding, waiting, feeding off the silence of those too polite, too trusting, or too late to notice.